Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ware Harmon. I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of our organization and our friends at Third Place Books, it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's live stream conversation with Kehinde Andrews and Russell Brand as part of our Civic series. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And we thank you all for joining us here on our new streaming platform, mytownhallseattle.org. We hope you're able to reach the program easily and are enjoying the benefit of accessing your tickets and events in one virtual location. Like everything at Town Hall, it's a work in progress. So if you have any questions or concerns, please use the patron services email that you'll see below in the chat. Today's conversation will run around 60 minutes, including a Q&A with Professor Andrews, with Kehinde. Questions will be selected from those in the chat field at the bottom of the video player. You may have to scroll down to see it. Feel free to add yours at any time. We can't guarantee we'll get to every question, but try to get to as many possible if you keep them concise and, as we like to say, in the form of a question. For those who would like to view the program with closed captions, use the CC button in the bottom right corner of video player. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. A few upcoming programs include a timely investigation of Amazon's impact on American and global labor with Alec McGillis and Professor Margaret O'Mara. Nicholas Freudenberg and Mark Bittman discussing capitalism's implications on all of our health, and a special online edition of our annual Kings Snohomish County Regional Spelling Bee, along with upcoming appearances by Annabelle Gurwitch, Susan Orlean, Cass Sunstein, Pramila Jayapal, Nathaniel Rich, Sonora Jha, and Ijeoma Oluo. You can learn about those and many more on our calendar at townhallseattle.org. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Civic series is supported by the Real Networks Foundation, the True Brown Foundation, KUOW, the Winco Foundation Northwest, and the Norcliffe Foundation. But finally, Town Hall is at heart a member-supported organization, so I want to thank all of our members watching today. If you share Town Hall's dedication to maximum access to ideas and performance across our community, I hope you'll consider a membership too at the My Membership button on the left navigation. One final piece of infomercial, I promise. You'll definitely want to go deeper on this afternoon's topics. I hope you'll consider purchasing your copy of Kehinde Andrews' book today from our partners at Third Place instead of later on from some other online retailer of books and groceries and hiking apparel. You know what I mean. Town Hall asks you to think about keeping it local, and just maybe the things we love about our city from before the pandemic will still be here with us on the other side. On to today's program. Colonialism and imperialism are often talked about as distant memories, whether they're glorified in collective nostalgia about the days of the British Empire or taught as a sin of the past in history classes. But imperialism, Kehinde Andrews argues, is very much alive. It's just taken a new form. Kehinde Andrews is professor of Black Studies in the School of Social Sciences at Birmingham City University in the UK. Andrews is that country's first Black Studies professor, as well as the director of the Center for Critical Social Research, founder of the Hiram Bay Organization of Black Unity, and co-chair of the UK Black Studies Association. Professor Andrews regularly writes for The Guardian and the independent newspapers, and has contributed to CNN, The Washington Post, Ebony Magazine, and The New Statesman. He's the author of Resisting Racism, Race Inequality, and the Black Supplementary School Movement, published in 2013, Blackness in Britain from 2016, and 2018's Back to Black, Retelling Black Radicalism for the 21st Century. He's also the editor of the Blackness in Britain book series published by Zed Books. Russell Brand's career spans stand-up comedy, acting, broadcasting, and writing. He's the author of the 2017 New York Times bestseller, Recovery, Freedom from Our Addictions, and his weekly podcast, Under the Skin, is available on Luminary. Brand lives in the UK with his wife, Laura, their daughters, 2 dogs, 2 cats, and a flock of chickens. So glad I informed you of all that. Andrews' book, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World, is the subject of today's talk. Please join me in welcoming Russell Brand and Kehinde Andrews.
Thanks. Should we just kick off the conversation then, Kehinde?
Yeah, I didn't know you had chickens. That for me is news. So
we could break that down if you want. If it strikes you as a priority to go through the bios, particularly in my livestock.
Watching the Meghan Markle Oprah interview, they had chickens as well. Chickens are obviously an important feature.
Oh yeah, that's right. It's a symbol of domesticity, I'm sure. Mate, your book, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World, is what we're here to discuss. for you, is the publication of this book at a time where revelations around the kind of deaths, casualties, and the people most affected by coronavirus are sort of present in people's minds, while the effects of the killing of George Floyd are still having widespread cultural ramifications, and we're seeing how that's being handled through public messaging, corporatization, and the sort of and also, I suppose, in the sort of, can we call it the afterglow of the sort of election of Joe Biden? How do you think that where do you think your book is particularly relevant in the evolving conversation around race? Do you think things are improving? Where does this book take us at this particular moment?
I think the timing is good in some ways, because we did have the Black Lives Matter summer. We've had a lot of attention on race and racism over the last year or so, which is good, right? But I think one of the things I'm happy the book's come out kind of a bit after that is because we've seen a lot. Just because you have attention on the issue of racism doesn't mean it's a good thing. And I think you look at some of the responses from corporations. I like football, basketball. You've got these symbolic things. We've taken a knee and Black Lives Matter, and you've got L'Oreal changing the name of its skin lightening product, but keeping the skin lightening product, but just changing the name. You kind of got this rebranding that's happening, and you've got this conversation about race and a lot of books actually about race. I won't name any of them. Where you kind of end feeling comfortable, like we're making progress, isn't it great? And I think that why I'm happy the book's come out now is it's hopefully a reminder that you shouldn't be comfortable. This is not good. Things aren't actually getting better. Things are really just as bad as they've ever been. To start off on a happy note, obviously.
That's right, and hopefully we can maintain this air of optimism throughout the conversation. Now, one of the things that I most enjoy about your critique of capitalism through the lens of race is the false narrative of meritocratic post-colonial power, i.e. the story of the West as the sort of creator of this sort of pure culture, and the ideas that are precluded, and the truths that we don't incorporate into that story. Can you tell me a bit more about what you mean by that? Because I know it's something that's covered in depth in this book in particular.
Yeah, so we have this idea that, the West is generally built on positive things like political revolution, scientific revolution, the political revolution, and we're making progress and moving towards this kind of meritocracy. And the one thing that has changed in the last 50 years is that there is more diversity, right? I'm a Black Studies professor, which is unlikely now given the statistics, but certainly 50 years ago it wouldn't happen. And so we like to congratulate ourselves and say, well, look, isn't this great? Things are changing. But actually that misses the point that the system is deeply built on white supremacy. It's built on the exploitation of labor, resources, land of the underdeveloped world for the benefit of Europe. And that's still the same today. It hasn't changed in any way, shape or form. So if you look at the global economy, Africa, so-called sub-Saharan Africa is the poorest part of the world. The West with white people in it is the richest. And then you have this hierarchy in between, which is literally white supremacy. So we're all patting ourselves on the back about how great things are, but actually things are exactly the same as they've always been.
What do you think the likely consequences are of the not your ideas, but the stories you tell about race, the perspectives you provide about race? What do you think are the likely impact on, I suppose, given that we're broadcasting in sort of Seattle primarily, that we are both English men. What do you think the impact on sort of Western English speaking diverse cultures, and also speculate a little on what you said on the sort of poorer parts of the world, i.e. sub-Saharan Africa? If we were to start exploring, resolving and putting right these ideas, what would be the impact on, I want to say sort of our countries, and in before you try and trip me up, I mean you and me as English people, they're the same.
I'm an English person there. I think I was getting insulted in this time of day.
It's all sorted, you're English. On the sort of, what would be the impact if we were to explore and try to resolve some of the things that you are describing?
Yeah, so the problem is, which is why, when these ideas do come out generally, I'm not really new ideas, just explaining them in hopefully a different way, is that to actually resolve this, the impact on the West, on places like America, on Britain, where I say I live, I won't go as far as saying English, but where I live, I certainly live in England. The impact would be devastating, right? Because the reality is the wealth that we have, the wealth that allows us to do this, particularly this actually, Zoom, computers, technology, etc. The reason we have that wealth is because we exploit it from the other parts of the world. So if we stopped doing that, that would mean the economy would collapse. All right, at least that's so. When I'm making these arguments, really, these arguments are in many ways actually more for the underdeveloped world, because that's who has to benefit. I mean, we spoke debates before, but I do think it's unrealistic to think you're going to get revolution in place from us, where even me now, I benefit from this too, right? It's kind of unrealistic to expect revolutionary politics to emerge in the place where people are benefiting from the fruits of exploitation. And this is why you do need a global understanding and a global argument, because we're not getting lit. You know, Britain generally is not really a revolutionary place, and America the same way. Like there's too much. We have too much to lose in this fight to expect us to be the ones to push it.
Your perspectives are, I'm using the word radical, and of course, like I suppose, unpack that term a little bit. I mean, radical in terms of what's being offered by, say, neoliberalism as a kind of progressive narrative now. I would ask you, Kehinde, to sort of talk a bit about what we have certainly discussed before when you mean when you said that that Donald Trump is a better president for African Americans than Barack Obama, and sort of you explained to me that the racism is more overt and explicit, and how you would update that given the sort of election of a new sort of comparable president, sort of in a presidency that's often described as sort of Obama's third term. What do you think is the distinction between overt, in-your-face, Confederate flag, Nazi symbology, white supremacy, and progressivism, and we'll change some of our skin products so the language is more favourable?
There's a quote in the book where I say the greatest thing the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Then the greatest trick of white supremacy is to convince us we're making progress, right? And so anytime you have symbols that make you think you're making progress, that has to be the worst thing. And that's why I say Barack Obama was for black people, not for America, not as a president, was clearly a better president than Donald Trump, right? But for us, it was 70%. I think the poll of African Americans when he got in was 70% thought that he was the achievement of Martin Luther King's dream, right? In a country where actually is worse race. If you actually look at the statistics and the life chances of African Americans today, they're actually probably worse because of mass incarceration than when King was alive, right? So the idea that Obama or Meghan Markle or me or whatever, any black people who do well and get into these white institutions is progress, that's the worst possible thing, because the main thing that we need to do is to understand that the system is inherently racist and inherently against us, and that we need to get rid of it. So Trump's better because Trump shows you what the system is. There's no hiding it, there's no pretending, there's no, oh, isn't it better? We all agree it's terrible. And he's a really good representation of white supremacy. And so that's the argument. And it goes back to Malcolm X. First time I quoted Malcolm, won't be the last. But Malcolm X talks about the northern fox and the southern wolf. And the southern wolf is the one who's in the South, he's beating you with the billy club, he's racist, he's calling you the N-word, and everybody fights and resists. But then you get to the north, you have this northern fox, who's the liberal, who shows their teeth in a smile. They're still going to eat you. You just feel better, right? You're tricked into it. And that's what Obama was. And certainly that is what Joe Biden's awful. Like, Joe Biden was literally picked because he was a white man, and as a white man, he would be kind of in the middle, right? And if you look at his history, some of the people he's consorted with, Strom Thurmond, he was against bossing it. His record on racism is appalling. If we actually genuinely think he's better than Trump, then that shows us how problematic our understanding of racism is. System was always the same. Trump, Obama, Biden, white supremacy was exactly the same in each way. It just played out. We just don't understand it as clearly when we've got the fox at the seat of power.
These delusions are perhaps remain as attractive and as powerful as they do for many people, because to countenance them as delusions, to confront the kind of delusions that you are describing, the economic reality of geopolitics, the level of persecution and racism on a sort of a practical way, not just cultural racism, but economic racism, as the example you cited about the mining of minerals, the poverty in the continent of Africa. These kind of changes are so radical that and the ideas are so distinct and beyond what's currently comfortably discussed in the muted tones of corporatized gestural progressivism, that do you see it as plausible that these ideas can enter the mainstream? And the sort of second part of this, and this is like in some of the books that I imagine you're alluding to, there's sort of a lot of talk about, like, you know, how white people shouldn't turn to black people and go, can you help me understand racism, like kind of a patronizing thing. But in terms of, I'm speaking to you sort of on the basis of, you know, I'm assuming this is directly to me. My name's not in this book, but it says revolution is necessary. And then that's this I know to be the sort of thing that you would write in a book, and hopefully that's bespoke for me. How are these ideas going to be popularized and mobilized without the participation and alliances between people of all races and from various, you know, positions on the social scale? And I would add to that, as a, you know, sort of a person from what, you know, we would call a blue collar white background, that of course, you know, I'm not trying to get in a league table with a professor of black studies, but like I'm saying that I think that a lot of the tension that's currently felt is because I feel like a lot of economically underprivileged white people think, hang on a minute, where's my fucking jewelry and treasure trove? You know, so what kind of alliances can be formed when your arguments are so clear and so elegantly defined and have such veracity, but are defined along racial lines? And is that something that even bothers you, even just for practical reasons?
Yeah. I mean, all right, two parts of the answer. So one is, the worst way to think about this is nationally. So look, nationally. And we do this, and actually black politics does this all the time as well, where we look nationally and say, oh, look, the main issue is police violence. Look, it's a main issue, it's a big issue, don't get me wrong. But actually we need to look globally. And if you look globally, then one, ironically, you find far more alliance, because actually me being here and anybody who lives in the West, that's kind of the big defining line. Were you born in the West, or were you born outside of the West? That one question will answer 90% of your life chances. Like, we literally don't, even the poorest person here is the top 80% of the world. You know, a child dies every 10 seconds because they haven't got access to food. None of those children die here. Like, we just don't even understand. So that's the big thing. And if you look at this globally, then straight away you can see white supremacy. And straight away we can stop having this conversation about the white working class, because the white working class are not at the bottom, right? The bottom is in the underdeveloped world. And the reason why, you know, but also black people, that makes us a bit different, is because 50 years ago, we certainly weren't in it at all. Like, we weren't part of it. We were so discriminated, we weren't part of it. But now we kind of are in it, right? So like, I am in it. Like, I can't pretend I benefit more than most people. And so the question then becomes, when we're trying to draw the political line, what are we trying to do? It isn't necessarily in my economic interest, personally, to say, let's overturn capitalism, because I do quite well out of it. But it is in my interest politically, because obviously my politics runs through African diaspora, and that's the root. So when I say Black Revolution, and that's when I say I'm not British, that's kind of what I mean. Like, I am, obviously I live here, I'm born here. But when I say where's my political affiliation, is with Africa and the African diaspora, and that's a revolutionary thing to say, because that puts you with those at the bottom. And in terms of understanding where white people fit in there, if I'm 100% honest, I don't know. I just say I don't know, but that's fine. I think that I don't know. I always listen. We have this conversation all the time. I haven't come up with a good answer to the what could white people do alliance question.
What did Malcolm? Then turning to one of your great mentors, stroke heroes, Malcolm X. Where did he, over the course of his career, from like sort of, you know, the Nation to his, you know, after his trip to Hajj and all that, how do you, and also the other part of this question is that he saw things, I feel, through a spiritual lens, as opposed to like, and I still feel that when you're talking about biopolitics and geopolitics, it still feels that for me that the inflection is somewhat Marxist, as opposed to the kind of spiritualism espoused by Malcolm X or Martin Luther King or Gandhi. Like, I wonder if you think there is, when you're talking about a challenge on this scale that's going to require sacrifice, huge sacrifice, like for anyone who wants to participate in it meaningfully, do you think that they can be mobilized by purely economic arguments, or might there need to be a sort of a spiritual component? And that seems to me to be what you're reaching for when you talk about your allegiance being with the diaspora as opposed to any sort of national identity, which is completely plausible and understandable given what, I understand what you've been through personally and what, your knowledge of this sort of subject. Do you think there's so the question again, because I know I ramble, is about like, is there a place for kind of a spiritual lens? And what do you reckon Malcolm would have said about like looking at it spiritually and the inclusion of not people that are not of the diaspora?
Yeah, so Malcolm, okay, so I started Malcolm and then come back. So Malcolm's only real change is he stopped seeing all white people as being actually individual devils, which is a kind of nation thing. And when he leaves the nation, he's like, well, no, that's not really the case. But white society is devilish, is evil. And white society needs to go. Like, white supremacy needs to end, right? And he kind of does offer an olive branch in the Ballot or the Bullet. And I recommend everybody listen to the Ballot or the Bullet. It is the best speech to understand racism today. Speech, text, whatever you want to call it. And his basic argument is, look, we're going to do the Black Revolution. That's going to happen. And you have a choice. You can either have a non-violent revolution where you just listen and say, look, let's change. Let's try and do something else. Or you're going to get overturned. And that's it. And that's at the end of his life, where he's saying, look, we can't rely on white people. And not because they're white. This is an economic. Malcolm is kind of pushing at the economics here, saying, look, you can't expect people who are benefiting from a system of oppression to be the ones to overturn it. So he's essentially, the Ballot or the Bullet is a threat, basically. So look, the Black Revolution is happening. You have the opportunity to just get out of the way to get on board, but it's happening. And that's what Malcolm's politics is. It's a Black Revolution. In terms of spiritual, Malcolm is spiritual, and Malcolm's like devout Muslim, but the difference between Malcolm and King, when he leaves the nation, because the nation is heavily religion, you join Islam, you join the nation, that's solution, that's salvation. When Malcolm leaves, he's still a devout Muslim, he goes to Saudi Arabia, he gets money, he starts a mosque, but he very, very clearly separates his religion from his politics, like really clearly. He says, that's fine, I'm a Muslim, but actually the Black Revolution is something else, and that is inclusive of Black people, Christians, non-denominational, if you're not religious, etc. But the thing that is spiritual, which I do 100% agree with you on, is me, or even not Malcolm probably, but me now saying I'm with the diaspora. That's not an economic argument, because like I said, I benefit from racism, so there's no economic reason why I'm doing that. That is political. It isn't just spiritual, because because racism frames how everything interacts. Even as a Black person who does very well, I still experience racism all the time, like literally every day. Actually, that's Meghan Markle. Like, that was a good example of no matter how high you get, you're still experiencing racism. So there is a material element to it that we just can't escape racism. But honestly, the Blackness, I always say Blackness is a choice. I don't have to choose to say I identify with the oppressed. I could choose to say I identify with I don't know, who's our equalities minister? I could be a Black Tory and say that's great. So you're making a choice, and that probably has a spiritual dimension to it. Definitely, yeah. And I think actually Malcolm probably would have put that in the kind of African spirituality. This is where I don't get into this in depth, but there is this idea that we're linked to the ancestors, that you can't understand where you are without going backwards. There is that connection, and I think Malcolm definitely would articulate that as well. Blackness is a choice, and that choice, I guess you could call it spiritual. I'd probably call it political, but maybe we'll say the same thing.
In a sense we are, because they're both transcendent of the dominant cultural ideals, i.e. nationalism, whether it's ethno-nationalism or a kind of more inclusive form of nationalism, or capitalism. You're saying that there are no solutions. But this is why I suppose, like, I continually sit and listen to the hard edge of the Malcolm X stuff, because I feel like everything you say is, I feel like there's going to be no change within the parameters of the existing system. It will require a revolution. And so, like, all the while I'm assuming that ultimately the dispossessed of the world, regardless of their history, would benefit from these ideas. That's sort of what I'm assuming. and you know, like you, I'm thinking, oh my God, ultimately this will require of me that I don't, you know, like look at this lovely drape and this plant. This is not a particularly expensive hoodie, but at some point sacrifices will need to be made. That this is what appeals to me. So what you're saying is, it seems to, like, you know, this is why again it becomes a kind of a spiritual argument, or at least, you know, certainly an ideological one, but I would say like that to make a connection that goes beyond rationalism is in its sense derived from emotion, and now we're in the mix, I would say, the kind of movement, you know, this kind of a post-reparation, radical, sort of pan-national black movement requires a kind of the breakdown, or like whether that's a personal or, you know, cultural and social breakdown of the kind of allegiances we have. Like, and I wonder, mate, what you reckon Malcolm X would make of like the incorporation of affluent, or in other ways successful, black people into their, should we call it the dominator, given that you're saying white supremacist, into the dominator culture. What do you think Malcolm would make of that? And is that kind of a palliative, and is that a massive risk for the kind of movement you're talking about?
Oh yeah, Malcolm had very clear terms for all of this, which people have now become racial slurs apparently. But I'm going to use them because they're not racial slurs at all. So two really important things from Malcolm on this one. One is the concept of the house Negro, which is just a really important intellectual concept, where what you're saying is that nothing's new, right? And if you think about the plantation, there's always been people who've been slightly better off, right? So if you were in the house, you were still a slave, it was still terrible, but you were slightly better off because you weren't in the field, you weren't doing that, you were doing domestic labor, right? Rather than field labor. And then what he was saying with that is, if you look at the house Negro, because of that, because they're slightly better off, because they're slightly preferential treatment, they're closer to the master, then they're more likely to identify with them. They're less likely to want to rebel and to overturn. And he says that in relation to people like me now, right? Middle class people like myself. And I would have to say right now, I'm a house Negro. No way to go get past it. Wow. I don't suffer I don't live in the field. I'm doing the right? And so what Malcolm's warning us is, when you're in that position, it's really easy to miss the point, to think that because you're doing all right, everybody can do all right. That you're not enslaved, that you're not discriminated against, right? And that's what he's warning people. Say, no, even people like me, I'm still black, I'm still racially discriminated against. I still need to rebel. And that's, I think, a lot of people have missed, because as we get more into it, the less likely we are to want to rebel from it, because we feel part of it. And feeling part of it is the worst thing you can do.
If because of historic and ongoing racism, race from the perspective of the kind of ideas that you're espousing in your book, another pack shot, remains a necessary determinant, are you to some degree not accepting, or does this idea, is it not accepting the sort of terms and parameters of the dominant culture by insisting that yes, race does continue to be a dividing line, not something that we can transcend? I mean, like in a system where we've overthrown capitalism and nationalism, don't you think at that point, all right, now we can start saying we're all God's children?
How are you going to overthrow capitalism? What I try to do in this book in particular is to really point out that capitalism is racism. Like, you don't have anything we have without racism. You need the genocide in the Americas to wash away the natives so that the West can go in. You need slavery. I mean, without the Atlantic system of slavery, none of this happens. Literally, none of this happens. There is no Western democracy. There is no capitalism. And when Europe, in 1492, when Columbus sails the ocean blue, Europe is behind. Europe's the only part of the world that was in the Dark Age. And it's only through the Americas and the Atlantic system that Europe gets massive amounts of wealth and is able to then take over the rest of the world, to have industrialization, etc. And then if you look at the basic logic, and this is what the book argues, is that the basic logic since 1492 has been that black and brown life is disposable for the benefit of white life. And if we're honest, today, that hasn't changed. So you can't end capitalism without ending. Capitalism and racism, they're intertwined. So you have to get rid of, the idea you can get rid of capitalism without getting rid of racism is one of those delusions of white left, right? That these are separate things. They are not separate. They are entirely intertwined. And in fact, white supremacy comes before capitalism. In fact, white supremacy is the bedrock of what makes capitalism. You don't have the white working class without slavery, genocide, and colonialism. That comes beforehand and is essentially sets the table for industrial relations to happen. And Marxism's got it completely wrong is saying that actually it's class first. No, it's not class first. It's white supremacy first. And everything else is built on white supremacy. So if you want to actually have proper revolution, you have to get rid of white supremacy.
I'm not disputing that, obviously. I would be rather foolhardy to come on here with you, a professor of Black Studies, to promote your book and then gainsay your central argument. But what about, though, prior to colonialism, the kind of feudalism and sort of serf cultures that exist where there is no ethnodiversity? Are they not instantiations of a comparable paradigm which is supercharged when race becomes part of the conversation, because then you can make all sorts of overt distinctions and all of that? What do you think about that?
No, there's a distinct sort of, actually I do this in the book, because in the book I talk about the Arab slave trade, which Arab slave trade is one where Europe got the idea from. Most things in Europe aren't actually new ideas; they're just other people's ideas.
Can't even think of slavery.
not even slavery, right? So the Arab slave trade lasts longer. In fact, in some senses, you could say the Arab slave trade hasn't ended. It enslaves more people, but this is a perfect example where this is very different. So Arab slave trade was predominantly domestic service, right? It was like the enslaved were taken as trinkets, right? They were taken as trinkets. It was terrible. It was, conditions were awful. It was racist, really racist. Actually, the ideas of European racism you can kind of see here very clearly. But it wasn't productive wealth. In fact, there were stories of slave traders in the 15th century who had so much money, but they had nowhere to spend it, because they just had all this money from selling people, but they had nowhere to spend it. And what the difference with Europe is that slavery is the best example, but not just slavery. They turn Africans into commodities. So actually, the slave trade is not the most profitable part of the system. It's the plantation economy. It's the productive labor. It's taking millions of productive laborers and creating commodities like sugar, cotton, tobacco, which are absolutely essential for the rest of for the whole economy. And so that then gets built into the way that the institutions develop, the way the wealth develops, the way the logic of the system develops. And so the idea of exploitation of Black life for labor and resources is absolutely essential to the system which is built. And that has never happened in the history of anywhere. That is actually the defining feature of capitalism, which makes it so successful. And what still makes it so successful, because it's still happening, right? Like we're still doing it. And that's the difference. That's why you can't compare it to like other feudal societies.
I understand. I know that you've been, the only reason I bring it up is because part of me feels, Kehinde, like that, I think and I'm sure a lot of people, because of the way you make these arguments, the way you tell these stories, because of your personal authority as an educator and as a writer and as a man, can completely understand, and I suppose, given the nature of this discourse, I'm speaking for, like white people say, or hello, white people. I'm speaking for me, I guess. Jesus Christ, it gets so complicated, doesn't it, these days? I'm speaking for this part of my own face. My eyebrows don't even agree with this. But what I'm saying is that if we were to mobilize against these ideas, capitalism, nation, what could potentially be achieved afterwards? What could be achieved afterwards? So I'm not arguing with any of it. I'm not arguing with I'm not disputing what you're saying about history. I'm not disputing what you're saying about the present. I'm not disputing what you're saying about the racial component. But I'm saying, how do you create a movement that doesn't yield to just gestures, symbolic changes, the offering of as I said before, palliative measures. Here, come, like some of you can come to the party. This is you can make it on your own moxie and pluck, whether it's using you as an example or people that have achieved stuff in politics or sport or entertainment or business or whatever. How do you overthrow those ideas? How do you overthrow that matrix without support beyond a particular community, in this case the Black community? How can it change?
Well, no, so I mean my argument would be more in Back to Black, which is so this book is essentially a prequel to Back to Black, which was this is what revolution looks like, this is the Black revolution, etc. And the argument I made there is actually no, like if the Black revolution, which is Africa, if Africa freed itself from the clutches of the West, and in the West I include China and these other undeveloped countries, if Africa was to do that, that would end capitalism. Capitalism literally cannot survive if Africa is free and independent. So actually, the Black Revolution ends the system. Like it does end the system for everybody, and then we have to rethink. And one of the arguments I strongly make is that you can't. We've been on the right side of the argument for 500 years. There's no point in trying to convince white people. Like, yeah, maybe I can convince you, but I ain't convincing enough people. It's not gonna happen. Like maybe it's gonna happen, but I ain't got time for it. So I would happily hope to think it's possible, but I'm spending my time saying, well, how do we develop the revolution, which will make it, whether you agree or not, it won't matter. Because if Africa's free, the whole thing collapses and we've got to change, right? That seems like a much more secure way long term than trying to convince people who benefit from the system.
So Africa, like the countries of Africa, free from their current economic relationships with, e.g., China, and the corporate relationships that exist within those countries. If those end, if Africa became a sort of a United States of Africa and became autonomous, independent, and what do I want to say, sort of had authority within their sort of trading relationships, etc., you think that would be sufficient? And what you'd want, like a kind of repatriation, like a kind of Zionism.
Well, I mean, yeah. So if you think about it economically, just imagine if you had to pay proper prices for the commodities. I couldn't be talking to you on this at all, right? You literally couldn't. It was so expensive to have smartphones and laptops and all that. If you look at cocoa, sugar, look at oil palm, which is one of the most important things from products. You have to pay proper things for this. The whole thing collapses, right? So if you can remove Africa, and Africa is really important resource-wise, because even though it is the poorest continent on the planet, it is actually the richest, which is why everyone's in there and taking stuff out of it. So yeah, to remove it would then the system couldn't last. And then the question would be, what do we build after that? Well, that's a better question to be in. And I don't know. I mean, like, if you look at the Black Radical Project, it is ultimately says, let's get out of here, go back to Africa. But no, right now, but no one's saying that right now. Like, no one's saying get a boat and just leave. There's a lot of work. There's a lot of steps before then. So that's kind of like the utopian project. There's a whole load of steps before that.
Oh man, thank you. All right then, let's it's not really lighting up because it became sort of a bit like, and this is an intense subject in itself. But like, what about Meghan Markle, Piers Morgan, that deal? I know you've been all over media talking about that stuff. Anyway, but tell me what what we can take from that in both like the interview itself, Meghan Markle's personal experiences, and then say Piers Morgan. I know you've done some TV with in the past. Him subsequently leaving or whatever happened to him on his broadcaster and his show. Tell me what you think. What does this story tell us about race in the modern world?
So I think Meghan Markle finally Black people in Britain feel some connection to her, because I don't think they did. The most people I know didn't feel any connection to her before. And the conversation we were having about race when the wedding happened, that was like the perfect example of delusional, right? Like, isn't it great? Things have changed, and the royal family, that the premier symbol of white supremacy in the entire world, is going to change. That was complete nonsense. Then this is a much better conversation, because now she's telling you about experiences which are so bad that she wants to commit suicide. I mean, geez, you know how many people that resonates with? We have to go through that day to day. Like, even successful people like myself, the stress you have to go through as a Black person is unbearable at times, right? So for that to be part of the conversation now has to be a good thing, I think. And I think it's kind of shaken people out of some of their delusions. So look, the whole thing's a spectacle. Does it really matter? Of course not. They'll be fine, right? But sometimes you have to use these things to have. No, not sometimes. You have to use these things to have any conversation about race in the mainstream. And this is a much better conversation about race, at least. On the Piers Morgan thing, I think I have had a lot of conversations, probably too many conversations with Piers Morgan on that show. But I actually quite like the Piers Morgan conversations, because it's in the same way that Trump is a good representation of racism. So is Piers Morgan, right? That is what, like, in my world, I don't have to deal with Piers Morgan. Right? I work in academia, I work with Black people all the time. But one of the things that people always say, this is the most well known for that show, and it's Black people come to me in the street and say, "Oh, I have to deal with people like that at work, and now I know what to say. This is my reality. It's really good to have someone on our side." And I think when I think there's a danger when you lose someone like Piers Morgan, is that we go to this bland, like who they're replacing with some bland middle person where you just don't have any conversations about race at all. You don't get any. It's just really bland morning TV, and I think that would be problematic. In fact, of all the shows that talk about, think about it, that show talks about race and racism more than any other show on any TV channel, and it's a mainstream platform. Agreed, most of the conversations are pretty banal, but they did when he was there make an effort to talk about race, and it would be a shame to lose that, even though it is mostly spectacle and problematic. But I think we lose something when we don't have that, because I think people no, I don't think people definitely gain something from that. Black people, not the spectacle side of it.
How do you make these cases to Black people in positions of political power and in positions of economic power? How do you make these points to them, and what kind of response do you get, when you're talking about the sort of stuff we've been talking about?
Yeah, because this is the thing with the when people get into power and into institutions, there is this kind of, we want to, how do we make things nicer? How do we make things neater? How do we make sure that we're better integrating, right? And that is the kind of, well, actually, of course, you don't want someone like Piers Morgan on TV, because what you want to do is it wants to be more accessible and open space. But that's the problem, right? Like this idea that we can have a really a good conversation about a media that has a really reasonable space and platform to talk about racism, that's nonsense. And if you go on the left, I've been on the left wing show. No, there's no left wing shows because the BBC is definitely not left wing. But I've been on more, middle class liberal shows. It's just as bad, right? They're just not as open about it. And in a real way, like, there's too much. We need to have consensus. We don't need consensus. We need division. Division is fine. Conflict is fine. And actually having these discussions which show the conflict and show it so clearly is a really good way to illuminate the scale of the problem for people. Honestly, conflict is good. Consensus is bad when you're in a society which is based on white supremacy.
So you think that the direction that we've been going in, since, let's say, the election of Biden is, again, a kind of a palliative, things are going to be okay, is it a consensus? Vice president is female, is an African-American woman. You feel like that these are the kind of measures that sustain the kind of dystopic numbness in which white supremacy thrives? Yeah,
if we honestly think that the election of Joe Biden meant that white supremacy got any less in America, then we've lost completely, because it's not how it works, and we just focus too much on the on the Capitol riots, the racists, the open racists, people like Piers Morgan. Look, Piers Morgan is terrible. I'm not defending Piers Morgan in any way, right? But we focus and say, look, those are the racists, those are the bad people to get rid of, and we need to really embrace the liberal, nicer people. It's not about people, it's about the system, it's about the economics, it's about the institutions. And they have not changed. In any of this period, they've stayed identical. And we need to focus far more on what the institutions are doing and not the different individuals and personalities.
Have you ever spoken to people in positions of authority in, like, I don't know, Ghana or Kenya, where they're sort of like, yeah, this was because whenever I've spoken to people who who's have connections there, historic connections in government or whatever, tell me about some dam getting built over there, and Nixon was foreign minister at the time. It's totally, it feels to me like that there's a kind of political and economic intransigence that, the way the government is structured in those countries would mean, I don't know how you get an uprising. I don't know where that kind of radicalism comes from in those countries. And the only time you see it is when it's sort of underwritten by religion. Again, like when you see sort of sudden surges of change.
Yeah, no, the problem is that when we think about the British nation, we tend to think of this island, but it's not. It's broader. It's Ghana, Nigeria. They're all part of Britain, and actually, the political class are British. They're probably more British than you, right? In terms of their education, their values, etc. Where they got their education from, they all come to England and get their brain poisoned by international development stuff, right? Like when we're talking about, Malcolm. Go back to Malcolm. Malcolm had a word for it: Uncle Tom leaders in Africa. And this is a class of people, let's just be honest, who were actually installed. So they were radical leaders who wanted to do different things. They were all either killed or imprisoned or ran off. And there was this class of leader who was put in place, installed to maintain the Western social order. And again, that's not new. Like under colonialism, there were chiefs who were put in place to govern and rule. Most people who rule stuff in Africa were Africans, but paid by Europeans. This is no different. So the political class in Africa, not all of them, I am generalizing it, because it's not everybody, but generally the political class in Africa is not a class you would ever look to for revolution. That's a class you're looking to. The whole point there is to be regressive. And yeah, in a real level, I went to Nigeria and was talking this talk, and the students were like, yeah, that's great, but you know, if we talk like that, we just get killed. Like literally, we just die. You know, it's not like this. We're just, and that there is a real authoritarian rule there. But that's why it's more important. And I said these ideas are actually far more important on the African continent, because that's where you can actually get real change. And if you look at a place like South Africa is a perfect example where what you have, because the radical elements have been, you know, got rid of, there's this extremist element that we're seeing. As you see with Boko Haram in the north, as you see, it's a kind of an extremist. We know we don't like this. We want to be violent and do stuff. And you're seeing this in South Africa as a kind of place where, because 25 years after apartheid, 26 years now, however many years after apartheid, desperate conditions. You're seeing migrants from other African countries get burnt to death. You're seeing a real rise of xenophobia. That's a place where you're either going to see a massive rise of extremism because people are desperate, or you're going to see radicalism, which says, no, we're going to have to do things differently, overthrow this government, etc. But unfortunately, the likelier one is extremism, because people get turned by crazy ideas, desperation, etc. But no, revolution. I mean, when I say revolution necessary here, in someone like South Africa, if it doesn't happen, something terrible will happen. And Nigeria is the same way, and all the rest of the continent the same way, because the conditions people are living in, we can't even really comprehend it.
No, I suppose not. And I was thinking while you were talking there, mate, that you have like a figure like Nelson Mandela go from being regarded as a terrorist in the sort of through the lens of the media of the countries, you know, we're in, to becoming the president of that country and a sort of celebrated global hero. Do you think that he was sterilized and neutralized through that process somehow? Because how does that not represent, you know, and I'm not suggesting that it did, how does that not represent the beginning of the kind of change that you're talking about? Why didn't it? What happened?
Yeah, no, because they sold out. I mean, Mandela sold out. Like, just be honest. Like, just say it as plain as you can say it. They're not just Mandela. I mean, the whole political class. You know, there was if ever a country needed an actual pick up arms and have a revolution, it definitely was South Africa. But they made a deal where this is what happened in the rest of Africa. You have your political independence, right? In theory, but economically, everything stayed the same. And if you look at South Africa today, this apartheid basically never ended. Like, there was this whole thing about white poverty in South Africa. Less than 1% of white people in South Africa are poor. 50% of Black South Africans live below the poverty line. And it's a poverty line which is, again, unimaginable in the UK. And that's almost three decades after apartheid. So they sold out. They sold out because they didn't want to have conflict. They wanted to have, you know, I don't know. I'm not going to say they sold out, because I think part of the reason they sold out is they didn't want a war. They were trying to avoid a war. They were trying, how can we have a peaceful transition? But again, you need conflict in white supremacy. And anytime it's consensus, you're not going to win. So it's going to maintain the systems of oppression.
When you have entrenched systems of power that are so potent and immovable, what is the value of the kind of cultural conversations around like language, inclusivity, diversity, representation? What are the value, you know, like I notice now in our country, that's what I'm calling it, like much more diversity in commercials on the TV, right? So so tell me, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, if you take from a purely radical argument, it's actually a bad thing, not a good thing, because again, it makes us feel better, right? If I turn the TV on, I can see Black families in Sainsbury's, and I feel like it is my country, right? It's not my country.
Is there any part of you that feels that that's good for your kids and stuff, like, or do you just think, fuck all that bullshit, I'm a radical man?
No, so look, on the actual, there's two parts of this. So on the actual, how do we survive in this system? It's a good thing, right? Like, it really is cultural violence to only see white people, you know, seeing Black images, and that's, you know, if I'm saying how do we survive the system, it's a good thing. I don't want to say it's all bad. You know, people need jobs. That's good. You know, people get jobs. People feel better. That's all good. And my kids, I guess it's good for them, right? But in terms of, is it good for where we need to be politically? No, it's not, because it makes us feel that we're more connected to it. It does make us our countries, our this. We feel a part of it. And if we, and the moment that we say this is the kind of things we need, like, you know, you'll very rarely hear me campaign for more black professors. You can have 600 black professors. This ain't solving the problem. Like, you know, it's not. That's not the solution. So when we're focusing on these as the solution, it's a problem. But if we're saying, look, of course you should have more representation, of course you should. Fair enough. But these are not, cannot substitute actually systematic economic structural change.
Yeah, it has to be a byproduct of meaningful change, not the focus of the change.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing would be to that, I'm trying to be positive, because why not? Let's be positive.
Yeah, because remember, I know your publisher said when you was writing your book, can you put something in there that's good for white people that might want to buy your book? I'm looking for it, Kehinde. I'm a white. Do you know how my people have suffered? Do you know what we've been through? We look through these books written by black professors. What's going to cheer me up?
You've definitely got that book. I tell you. It might be like, no, but Catholics like self-flagellation. If you're a Catholic, you love the book. It's self-flagellation. That's what you need. But no, on a positive level, though, there is, what's the way I put it? So this is how I justify my being a professor. Maybe just is self-serving. But if you think about it, on the plantation, there were preachers. There were slave preachers, and the whole purpose of the slave preacher, it was to teach a version of religion that kept people down, kept people oppressed. That's what they did. And most of them did that. They went around teaching this terrible gospel and kept them down. But when you're a slave preacher, you also were the only one who was allowed to read. You were the only one who was allowed to travel between different plantations. You were the only one who was allowed to talk to big congregations of people. And it's not coincidental that, you know, a large number, probably most of the slave rebellions, were led by slave preachers, right? Because they had access, they had the ability to do that. And that's the one thing about when you have like jobs like I have, or access into media, stuff like that, and you have access, that gives you a privilege to do things that other people don't have. The problem is the proximity to that privilege usually makes us go quite conservative and not want to rock the boat. But what we should be doing in that positions of privilege is using it to overturn the system. And that's possible, but that does involve, like you said, there's maybe spiritual. You call it spiritual, I call it political. But that's why it's really important that we understand the scale of the problem and the scale of the things that need to change so that we can use those privileges to overturn the system.
It's brilliant, mate. Before we start the Q&A, which I believe is due to start, the sort of areas that I like, next time we talk on, on some other platform or forum that I'll be talking about is like liberal white guilt and the fact that I think it's futile and impotent and doesn't contribute to anything other than perhaps the sort of perpetuation of these gestures. Rage of disempowered white people who feel that they don't, whilst comparatively they may do better than a person of colour in the same economic class, that don't help none. And like how to sort of what to do with these sort of, I know it ain't your problem, but it's sort of partly mine. Like it's how to get rid of these red herring, pointless, hopeless, disempowering things that, that could be resources that could be mobilised for the very real struggle for revolution. But you've made your position pretty clear. You've spelled it out beautifully. You're a brilliant teacher. I always enjoy listening to you speak. I love reading your writing. I heartily recommend this book for people of all colours and ages.
That's on the more positive point. I do want to say, look, like obviously I always write from a black perspective very clearly, but I did try to write a book that says, look, this is what the problem is. And the first thing all of us, white people, black people, people need to do is to understand the scale of the problem. And it's uncomfortable. And it's not just uncomfortable for white people, it's uncomfortable for me as well. But that discomfort is where we need to be. That's where we should be in this moment. And then from that discomfort, you can make positive change, right? That's the positive argument.
Thank you, Kehinde. That was beautiful. I know you're doing your Q&A now. I'm going to hand back over to Ware. I'm going to stick around a little bit, watch the questions, see if they are actual questions, not statements. And
so far, so
thank
good,
you. I always enjoy it.
And Russell, thank you for
mate.
being the
Cheers.
tip of the white spear as we interrogate Kehinde's arguments. Really appreciate your being out in front for us.
Thank you very much.
That was a terrific conversation, actually. And we have 7 questions in the form of questions so far. And I've conveniently organized them into a couple of key issues. The first one starts, the first 2 actually, Kehinde, are about the police, actually. So, and they're related, so I'll read them both together. Do you find the abolitionist approach to dismantling white supremacist institutions useful, such as calls to defund the police? And a second questioner wants to know, what are your opinions on how the future looks for the police in the UK, given the distrust arising from race-based stop and search and the recent murder of Sarah Everard?
Yeah, again, just thanks to Russell for the conversation. Always enjoy it as well. And in terms of the police specifically, look, abolition just has to happen, right? Like we're thinking about the police. There is no way to reform it. And again, go back to the Black Panther Party, who really were the kind of one of the first, certainly really do a lot of the groundwork on what does this look like. You have to have our own, like they were basically, the Black Panther Party was saying, we have to police our own communities because you just can't rely on the police. The police violence is so much. They started out patrolling the police to make sure the police weren't committing acts of violence. And so, yeah, police abolition, that doesn't mean you don't have anything to protect the community. What that means is you just accept that, particularly in the United States, but also in the UK, the where the police have come from, they are the boots on the ground of racism. That's what the police do. That is their function. And they cannot have another function. So let's get rid of them and completely rethink what policing should be. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen, right? And this is why I say you need revolution. Because to be honest, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen in the States. It's definitely not happening here. It's the opposite. Like in the UK, we've just had this, well, it hasn't gone through, but it's going to go through because our electoral system means that our government can do whatever it likes. A really regressive policing bill that actually makes defacing a statue, you get more time in prison for defacing a statue than you would for rape, right? That's our new policing bill. All crazy powers are given to the police, even though we just had this big case with Sarah Everard, where a police officer is accused of kidnapping and murdering a woman. So there should be a time to say, actually, let's really think about police power. But it's a complete opposite. In the UK, there's just no chance of this going, which is again a reminder why this is about. You can't really deal with the police issue separate from the other issues because the police are just one part of society. And even if you fix the police, that doesn't fix the rest of the society, right? Because this is about the economics, it's about institutions, it's about everything. So the police issue has to be part of a much broader issue, I think.
If I was better at my job, I would know the exact community, but there is a community, I think it's in Michigan, maybe it's in upstate New York, where the mayor has a plan through to abolish the local police force and sort of rebuild with this system of public guardians and public service. I don't remember the structure, I can't do it justice, but there is like this nascent movement, I think, happening at one municipal level right now. And I'll be back in touch and let you know what that is, but that doesn't mean that the prospects for sweeping transformation in America are any better than in the UK, honestly. Next up, there's a question about, we're talking about, actually this pivots sort of to China and Africa. We're talking about white supremacy. How do you incorporate China's influence into your argument, particularly from an African perspective?
So actually, there's a whole chapter on the book, The Non-White West, which basically argues that if you look at China is a perfect example, but not just China, the Eastern countries, Brazil's involved in this, have essentially used the ladder of white supremacy to pull themselves up. And anti-Black racism is such a massive feature of what's happening. If you look at China in particular, their economic growth since, we kind of think about China as being communist and Maoist and all this. Mao died a long time ago. And when Mao died, they buried the Maoist vision. And from the late 70s, it really has been, how do we integrate ourselves into Western capitalism? And China's become the workshop of the world, right? It makes most things. It's the kind of place that produces commodities. But that doesn't, just because it's a few rich people, some Chinese people are doing very well, and that doesn't mean it's not based on the same principles. Why are things made in China? Because you can pay Chinese workers dirt, right? You don't have to pay them proper wages. So China needs to have about 400 million people living in dirt poverty, so they can take these ridiculous wages we'd never accept in the West in order to manufacture these goods. And then the second part of that is when you're manufacturing the goods, you have to get the resources from somewhere. And China is following exactly the same model as the West, going to Africa, stripping resources. It's not a coincidence that China's investment in Africa went up from 2001 to 2012. It went up by 20 times. After China joined the World Trade Organization. I mean, if they join the West and then start really just rinsing Africa for its wealth, China is probably worse than Europe at this point in that kind of resource extraction. So China's rise depends on lots of poor Chinese people and lots of poor African people. It's not new. It's just a continuation of the same
paradigm. Related, what are your thoughts on the president of Ghana telling the Swiss that they'll stop exporting raw materials like cocoa beans?
Let's see. That's what I say. Let's see. It's a nice thing to say, but it ain't never gonna happen. Like if that happens, I'll be so surprised because you can say it. And chocolate's terrible. That's actually the whole chapter of the book starts. The colonialism chapter starts with Cadbury World in England, which is like in Birmingham actually we have Cadbury factory, which was owned by Kraft. I think they might have sold it again. It's now an American company. And if you look at Cadbury, basically chocolate is a perfect example of where you have millions of people living in exactly the same conditions they were living in 100 years ago. Like the way they live, the farming, is appalling, right? So Ghana should say, no, you can't take it anymore. We can't take this exploitation, but they don't have the economic power to do it. It is a don't, because the whole economic system is based on leaching these products. And the sad thing is, if Ghana probably lose even more if they did stop them, because they just go somewhere else. There's plenty of other places that Swiss chocolate can go and get their cocoa from. So it's a nice idea, but you need to have the politics to back that up, and Ghana definitely does not have the politics right now.
Yeah. What parts do the IMF, the World Bank, and debt problems of developing countries play in perpetuating white supremacy?
Oh, they are the new models of white supremacy. So why I call it the new age of empire is prior to Second World War, it was European colonial countries like Britain Empire, Spanish Empire, French Empire, etc. Then there's a very clear shift to where the United States becomes the center. And rather than having European empires, it is IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization, United Nations. They're all created around about the same time. And they are the main mechanisms which make these trade deals, which provide loans to developing countries. And then those loans always come with these strings attached, which just further, austerity, take welfare, etc. Like, if you talk to most people in the undeveloped world, they understand that the IMF, World Bank, they're the devil. Like they are the new devil. So yeah, they are the basic ways, the main mechanisms for neocolonialism.
So we have 3 questions left here, and they all sort of put colonialism in context of other issues that we're confronting at the moment. You say we shouldn't expect revolution from the West. Don't you think that new post-capitalist ideas linked to ecology and the fact that capitalism is literally destroying the planet can play a big part?
Yeah, no, that was a bit. So Russell talked about it. There was a bit in the book where
That's
they
true.
said that.
I'm sorry,
There's a bit at the end where they said, can you be more positive? And my basic reach of being more positive was, this is an issue for us, but actually, if you look at what racial capitalism is doing, it's going to actually destroy the entire world. The end point of this is the whole world ends through climate crisis. So this should be a moment where we can step back from the brink and say, well, actually, how are we? Because you can't solve this problem of climate change just by putting emissions caps on. It's about the very principle of how you deal with the world, which is deeply linked to white supremacy and resource extraction, etc. So yeah, this is a moment where maybe you can. Unfortunately, if you look at how the left has generally dealt with this, they've ignored the issue of racism. There's no way you just deal with that without racism. This is a racial issue. Even if you look at where climate change is deeply affecting, that's a racial issue in itself. It sounds like God's a white supremacist if you actually look at the actual impacts of this stuff. But yeah, unfortunately, if you look at things like the Green New Deal, even in the Green New Deal that we have here in the UK, they just missed the point, honestly. And then that's not a new thing. The left has generally tend to miss the point on race and racism. But no, I do agree. There is a conversation you can have there, which does bring this all together. I'm just not sure that's the conversation that we're having.
I'm afraid I might have flipped the sequence on these. You'll see why in a moment. I probably should have posed this first. How do you think colonialism has impacted our understanding of gender and sex binary?
Yeah, no, I mean, if you look at, so in a very real way, if you think about one of the things that I always kind of push back on is if you look at Africa and you look at like the Caribbean, these are 2 of the places where you have the most clear kind of homophobic ideas, like man is this, woman is this, ideas, really clear. And sometimes it can be, well, that's not about Black culture. That's complete nonsense. Actually, if you look at where that comes from, that's colonialism. That is a particular reading of the Bible that was given to us by Europeans, which tied in heavily to white supremacy. And then white supremacy tied in with particular gender ideas and conservative ideas about sexuality, etc. And you can see that so clearly that riddles through certainly the Black African diaspora and in the UK and elsewhere. And yeah, this was. Yeah, I talk about race a lot, and obviously white supremacy generally in racial terms, but it isn't just about racial terms. There is a very particular view of gender, sexuality, etc., which we're still dealing with. right? And really still dealing with in the former colonies as well. Whereas I guess in the West, there's been some shift, some change, but we shouldn't get carried away with how much change there is. But no, these things are deeply intersected in how they play out.
Kehinde, last question. Do you have high hopes that you have hopes for achieving change? And do you think that there's a way that change occurs, including the white population, and peacefully? That's their question, not mine. I didn't write it, Russell. I just have to read it.
Okay, so I actually do. So I really want to say the book probably seems really pessimistic when you get to the end of it. But I'm not pessimistic at all. Revolution is not just necessary, revolution is possible. And revolution is probably probably likely. Because 50 years ago, when Malcolm's talking about revolution, that's a real thing. Like, it's not clear that capitalism is going to win. You've got communism, you've got Pan-Africanism, there's movements in Latin America. There's a genuine point where it's not stable, which is why so many people get killed. It's actually also why you get racial relation legislation. It's why you get independence. It's why you get me as a Black professor. There's a kind of let's give people a bit to make them feel a bit better. But 50 years is not that long, right? So in the next 50 years, as you see more and more inequalities just getting worse, Africa will have 90% of all the people living in extreme poverty in about 50 years. If you look at, even look at Black Lives Matter protests, people aren't accepting it. People are protesting and rising up. And that's going to continue to happen. And in 50 years, the world could be a completely different place. And I'm deeply optimistic that will happen. Cool. It has to happen. This is not the only alternative. Revolution is possible. We just need to understand the scale of it. It's why I wrote the book, because I wrote Back to Black and people were like, yeah, I get it. But it was very clear that I had to explain just how bad it was, because they really gauged it. You can't change this. It's not. So when you get to the end of this book, you should hopefully thinking, wow, we can't change the system. And then the next thing you think is, well, we need something new. And that's where we need to be, because the West is 250 years really of being prime. It's a blip in human history. There are many, many other things we can do. We just need to decide that we can do them. And hopefully, white people will come on board. Everybody will come on board. But like I said before in the discussion with Russell, if the Black Revolution happens, you don't have a choice. You have a change. Like you're gonna have to change. And I think that should be the emphasis, and to make everybody try and get on board, I think.
Not that I want to take our focus away from the new age of empire, but is Back to Black available to American audiences in some form right now? Is it still in print?
Yeah, I think so. I think I think you can get it from that place. Certainly the one you can order it online, it'll come next day. But I think it's generally available. Yeah.
All right.
But you can get it, I think you can get it other places too.
I'll encourage people to look for the future vision in that book as well, or we'll do it in follow up, because we're going to continue to promote the talk in the coming days, so that as more people have a chance to check out what you both share with us this afternoon. Russell, thank you for being a part of this. We really appreciate it. It's terrific. And yes, thank you. We look forward to hosting you in the flesh at some point. So come see the gum wall.
Oh, definitely. That sounds
come
disgusting.
see the gum wall.
But yeah. No, thank you. Thanks to Russell as well.
Everyone, make sure you go hit the buy the book switch, please. Or it's not a switch at all. It's a button. It's a big green button from our friends at Third Place Books to pick up the book now. Thank you all so much. We'll see you again soon.